Okay, so part 2, we're going to be looking here at page 1 of the W-4 instructions. And we want to go ahead and come on down and take a look at the entire form of the personal allowances worksheet. So let's go ahead and just scoot on down the page so that we can see the worksheet itself. And keep in mind that when you complete this worksheet, like it mentions here, you are going to keep this for your own records. So you'll definitely not turn this in. You will just determine here how many allowances you want to claim in box 5, and then you will cut it on the lines that it gives you, turn your W-4 into payroll, but this will be yours to keep for your records. So this little worksheet is the cause of much concern for workers across the country, because if you're not careful, it can add up to multiple allowances that you really don't qualify for. So being very careful with this is going to be quite important. So letter A here asks us to go ahead and claim a number 1 for ourselves. So we'll put in number 1 because you're normally going to claim yourself as a dependent. Some people absolutely do not claim themselves, but usually you will claim yourself. So that is okay to do. It's a pretty safe thing to do. In letter B, it says enter 1 if you are single and have only one job, or if you are married, have one job and your spouse does not work, or if your wages from a second job or your spouse's wages are less than $1,500. So let's say here that you're married and your spouse does not work. We'll enter a number 1 in here. So now we have a 1 for you and we have a 1 for your spouse. But let's think about it for a minute. If you were single, you already have 1 for yourself, and now it's telling you that you could enter another 1 for yourself because you're single and you only have one job. Why is it doing that? Well, we have to keep in mind what we talked about in part 1, which was the single rate of withholding is the highest rate. So chances are, if you're withheld at the single rate, you may have a little money coming back to you at the end of the year. So having this extra allowance, I should say, in here is not going to necessarily hurt you. But you must be careful because, as I mentioned, this form is going to help you overdo it. So you really want to watch this. If it were me and I were in this position, I would probably back off of this and change it to a 0 and only claim myself once. Okay, so watch out for that. Now, looking here, it also says if you're married, you have one job and your spouse doesn't work, go ahead and claim a deduction here, or an allowance, here. So that would be good. That would be 1 for you and 1 for your spouse. But then you look down here to letter C and it says enter 1 for your spouse. Okay? And it says, but you may choose to enter 0 if you're married and have a working spouse or more than one job. So you may want to think about that as well, especially if you've already entered 1 up here for your spouse. So since we didn't enter the spouse up here, let's go ahead and enter the spouse here, and we'll go from there. Now, letter D is enter the number of dependents other than yourself and your spouse that you would claim on your tax return. So this is where we used in the first scenario in part 1 that we had 3 children. 3 children living at home for at least 6 months out of the year. Okay? Letter D says enter 1 if you will file as head of household on your tax return. Now we want to know what head of household means, right? So let's take a look at the criteria above to read for head of household. It says generally you can claim head of household filing status on your tax return only if you are unmarried and pay more than 50% of the costs of keeping up a home for yourself and your dependents or other qualifying individuals. So you would need to read Publication 501 to get further information. So if you are a single parent, for instance, and you are sole support for you and your dependents, maybe you could go ahead and qualify under head of household. So let's just go ahead and say that you do qualify for that, and let's list a 1 for you there as well. Now we are adding up to quite a few here, so let's keep that in mind. But as we mentioned before, actually, we do have a spouse that we've qualified here. So we may not want to go ahead and file head of household there. Sorry about that. I don't want to throw you off. Let's back off of that one. Keep that in mind. Letter F. Enter 1 if you have $2,000 of child or dependent care expenses for which you plan to claim a credit. Now, the note says do not include child support payments. Okay, so that's something that you want to keep in mind. If you're paying child support, that's not considered a dependent care expense or a child care expense. Okay, that's considered just part of taking care of your kids. So, true bona fide child or dependent care expenses in at least $2,000 or more is what we're talking about. So, if you have that, let's say you do with 3 kids, let's just go ahead and put a 1 in there for that. Child tax credit, including additional child tax credit. It tells you to read Publication 972 to get more information about how that would work. But it basically says if your total income is less than $65,000 or $95,000 if you're married, enter a 2 for each eligible child, and then less 1 if you have 3 to 6 eligible children, or less 2 if you have 7 or more. So we have 3 children, so we're going to have 2 for each child. So that's 2, 4, 6. And then if we had 3 to 6 children, we're going to subtract 1. So we could have up to 6 allowances here minus 1. So technically we could have 5 allowances go into this box. Okay? Look at this. We're adding up to quite a few allowances here. And we're going to go ahead and do it, and then we're going to see what number we come up with. Okay? Letter H, add lines A through G and enter the total here. Okay? So A through G, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 plus 5 is 11. It says if you plan to itemize or claim adjustments to income and want to reduce your withholding, see the adjustments worksheet on page 2. So we could look at that. If you're single and have more than 1 job, or you're married and you and your spouse both work, you want to think about that. You want to look at the 2 earners worksheet on page 2. And if neither of the above situations apply, stop here and enter the number on line 5, like we did in part 1. So 11 allowances is what they're telling you that you could possibly come down here to line 5 and enter if you were an individual in this scenario who was married with 3 children. Now, 11 allowances, like I mentioned to you before, the more allowances you have, I mentioned 5, where you would pay little to no tax based on your income level, was going to be quite tricky and possibly a little scary come tax time. If you enter in 11 here, you're going to almost guaranteed pay 0 tax, and then when tax season rolls around, you're going to be looking at a situation where possibly you could owe tax, and so that's going to be a little scary too. So I would be very hesitant to follow this worksheet for that reason. Okay, so I wanted to go through this worksheet with you to show you why it is such a nightmare and why it steers people in such a bad direction. Okay, I wish the IRS would change this, because it really does not do justice to the taxpayers. Okay, so you need to make a decision that works for you. You need to talk to your tax advisor And you need to look at what your history has been with how you filed your W-4s in the past and how you've been paid. If this is your first job and you've never filed a W-4 and you have some of these situations like a spouse and you have children and so forth, and you're just now entering the workforce, and so this is all new to you, I would say that it would be a really great idea to get some counsel, and in the meantime, maybe only count yourself and one child on your worksheet until you really get a chance to see how much tax is coming out and how much that may reflect when it comes time to file your taxes. Okay? Because I can guarantee that if you put 11 down in box 5, you're going to pay little to no tax. Okay? And that is going to be possibly something that you'll regret when you go to file your income tax. Okay, so just really think very carefully before you choose a number that is that high. Alrighty, so that concludes our worksheet. Thank you for tuning in to part 2. And if you need to look at part 3, which discusses 2 earners or multiple jobs that a family might have, then stay tuned and we will do that in our final part.